before everybody else did. Danielle probably didn't see that on the live stream, so I wanted to point that out. That's why Marion singled me out. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I certainly do. It must just be one of those days in that regard for me. It was 30 seconds till time to get started, and I said, oh no, I don't have my microphone. And so I ran up the stairs to get my microphone, and I said, guys, where's my microphone? They said, well, it's not here. Here's where it was. It's not here. But you have something on your tie. So there you go. It's that sort of afternoon apparently for me. So it's not all old age. It's dealing with people like Ken that causes that, I think. That's what it is. You can open your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 1 in particular. It's my plan, and we'll do this sort of informally throughout the next several weeks. On Sunday evenings, I'd like to pick out a proverb here and there and focus on that proverb, maybe a set of proverbs. And I thought it would be good as a beginning point to that to sort of lay a foundation for Proverbs. And so that's what we're going to do out of the first handful of chapters. And you could really, depending on how strictly you wanted to do it, you could go through the first 3 to 5 chapters and really find a good foundation of the book of Proverbs. As the book of Proverbs progresses, it gets more and more, for lack of a better term, proverbial and less textual. But the first part of the book is thematic and textual in nature, which means that several verses form passages that are one unit. And really the beginning of the book of Proverbs does set a good foundation for the proverbs that are contained as you move into the heart of the book. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that this evening. And in particular, I want to notice 4 foundational ideas that are at the base of the entire book, but in particular are outlined in these first several chapters. First, I would like to notice that one of the foundational principles of the book of Proverbs is really a foundational principle for Solomon, and that is the fear of the Lord. You're familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, and maybe you're familiar with Solomon's conclusion at the end of the book. Hear the conclusion of the whole matter. What is it? Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. So Solomon ultimately concluded after his sinful experimentation in the world that fearing the Lord was the foundational piece to happiness on this earth and to salvation in the next. And so we recognize that fear of the Lord is foundational for Solomon in all of his writings. But it shows up in particular in the book of Proverbs. Some 16 times the fear of the Lord is mentioned in the book of Proverbs. And we'll notice just a few things that the fear of the Lord can do, just sprinkled throughout this book. You look at chapter 1 and verse 7, here it begins. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. In chapter 9 and verse 10, we hear that echoed. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. But it's interesting what fearing the Lord can do as it's described throughout the book of Proverbs. And really wisdom shares these qualities as well. The fear of the Lord can prolong our days. Chapter 10 and verse 27, the fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. Now, that ought to remind us the nature of a proverb, right? That's a general truth that generally proves itself to be accurate. Of course, there are some people who live wicked lives and live long lives. And there are some people who live righteous lives who fear the Lord, and unfortunately their lives are cut short. But generally speaking, if you want to live a long life, following the Lord, fearing the Lord, is the easiest path to doing so. And we see that idea sprinkled throughout the rest of the book. Chapter 14 and verse 27. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life to depart from the snares of death. Think about how many of the horrible things that life can offer us, how many of the dangerous things, how many of the risk-related things can be taken out of our path by following the fear of the Lord, by putting Him first in our lives. Chapter 19 and verse 23, the fear of the Lord tendeth to life. Proverbs describes the fear of the Lord as being able to lead us to riches. Chapter 22 and verse 4. By humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. And so all of those things are well and good, but what is the fear of the Lord? What really is it? What does it mean to fear the Lord? Does it mean to shake in our proverbial boots before the God of heaven, to live a life stricken by fright whenever we think of God? Well, not necessarily. As we look to the New Testament, we get a fuller picture of what the fear of the Lord is. Turn, for instance, to the book of Hebrews. Keep your finger in Proverbs there, but go to the book of Hebrews. And let's notice just a for instance relative to fear. Go to chapter 11 in that Hall of Faith chapter and look at chapter 11 and verse 7. It says, by faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Moved with fear. Now that's not phobos, the Greek word for physical, gripping fear, the fear you would have being faced down by a tiger or being attacked by someone dangerous. Rather, this is respect for the authority of God. A healthy respect for someone who is in a position of power over you. A similar idea is in Hebrews chapter 12. I want you to look near the end of that book, or of that chapter rather, Hebrews 12 and verse 28. Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Again, that's not shaking in our proverbial boots. That's a healthy understanding of and respect for the power of God. Recognizing who He is and conducting ourselves accordingly. That's godly fear. But I want you to notice the next verse. Verse 29 says, for our God is a consuming fire. You see, what I need us to remember is that true fear of the Lord is a balance between a healthy respect for His authority and a fear in the most physical and primal sense of what might happen if we disobey. Go back a few pages in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4. And you'll see that word phobos, which I said is that physical gripping fear, show up in this text. In verse 1, notice this command to those who are on the brink of falling away, those who are being tempted to fall back into Judaism, to give up Jesus Christ and go back to the law of Moses. And I want us to understand that the fear of the Lord, if we are on the brink of going into a life of sin, will look like this. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into His rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. Now, should we live a life just dictated by fright over what might happen if we're lost? No. I do know some Christians who live that way. They live in constant fright of potentially being lost instead of constant confidence in their path of life based on their obedience to God. But if we're on the brink of falling away, we absolutely should fear. And so is there a time and place for physical gripping fear? Absolutely. But the Christian's life and the foundation of Proverbs is a healthy respect for the power and might of God. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In essence, that connects us to what we spoke about this morning. The authority of God is the guide of my life, and when I submit to it, I am in the fear of the Lord. So according to the book of Proverbs, one of the foundational aspects of wisdom and all of the things that Proverbs will give us is fear of the Lord. But number two, not only fear of the Lord, but choosing a path. And the book of Proverbs really lays it out as simply as any book does. There are two paths. There's the path of wisdom and the path of folly. And it's shown in several different ways. And we'll notice as you begin in Proverbs chapter 1, I want you to look at verse 10. My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. Now, we didn't say this in the outset, but there are four quote-unquote characters in the book of Proverbs. There is the speaker, who is Solomon, the father, the giver of wisdom. Then there is the son. If we take that literally, that would be Rehoboam, who will one day be king. Of course, figuratively, that's anyone who sits at the feet of someone who's giving wisdom and instruction. Then there is wisdom personified. And then there is folly personified as a strange woman, we'll notice in just a moment. So he addresses his son, that is the recipient of wisdom. By extension, figuratively, that's you and me. And he says, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. And notice what they say. If they say, come with us, let us lay wait for blood, let us lurk privately for the innocent without cause, let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Now what's interesting is that folly and sin doesn't usually present itself in that direct a fashion, does it? Let us go and take advantage of people. Let us go do horrible things. No, it usually leads with the benefit. You see, as sin usually presents itself, it would start with verse 13. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. And at that point, many people fail to ask how it will come. How will the blessings arrive? How will we get these things? Well, many people don't ask that question. But notice the advice that Solomon gives. My son, verse 15, walk not thou in the way with them. But let me take it a step further. He says, refrain thy foot from thy path. You see, the foundation of the book of Proverbs is choosing carefully not to even step foot on the path that leads to sin. And so we see just on the outset that foundation of refraining from following the path of sin. Verse 16, why? For their feet run to evil and make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lay wait for their own blood. They lurk privately for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone that is greedy of gain, which take away the life of the owners thereof. Choosing not to step foot on the path of sin. Do not even begin that process. That's the foundation of Proverbs as we read it in chapter 1. But then wisdom chimes in and gives us the opposite, verse 20. Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief places of concourse, in the openings of the gates, in the city she uttereth her words. Compare that to what sin said in verse number 10, if sinners entice thee. The picture is of sin coming up close to you, and the strange woman will do this in just a moment. It's of sin coming up close to you in private scenarios and enticing and convincing you with whispers and promises. That's not how wisdom conducts herself. You see, wisdom doesn't have anything to hide. Wisdom doesn't need the darkness. Wisdom doesn't need the alleyways. Wisdom doesn't need to whisper. Wisdom cries aloud in the marketplace. Wisdom stands in the parking lot at Walmart and screams her message. Wisdom gets up on the bench in front of the court square and proclaims her message to the world, to anyone who will listen. Wisdom's not ashamed. Wisdom's not bashful. Wisdom has nothing to hide. And notice what she says. How long, verse 22, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? The scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I'll pour out my spirit unto you. I'll make known my words unto you. Just open your ears and I'll give you what you need. So the foundation of Proverbs is number one, fearing the Lord, respecting His authority. And then number two, choosing to refrain from the path of sin and choosing to adhere to the path of wisdom. See, that's the foundation, but it's a choice. There's never a time when Solomon says that he's going to force wisdom into his son's ears, that he's going to make him listen and make him heed. It's a choice. And we remember Rehoboam failed to heed his father's message. Do you remember? He had the choice to listen to his father's trusted advisors or to listen to his friends who would tell him what he wanted to hear. And he listened to his friends, his contemporaries. He rejected the voice of wisdom. And in so doing, he destroyed that unified nation and split it down the middle. You see, we have a choice, the enticement of sinners or the imploring of wisdom. But then as you get into the book, and especially these first few chapters, it really focuses in on these two paths and implores us over and over not only to choose the path of wisdom, but to open our ears and to continually listen to her words. Go to chapter 2. In verse 1, my son, if. And what I did long ago in my Bible is I put a box around that word if. And what you have here are conditional statements, if-then statements. In very basic computer language, there are if-then statements, right? In the most basic of logic and mathematics, there are if-then statements. Well, in religion, in our relationship to God, there are if-then statements. If, verse 1, thou wilt receive my words, and hide my commandments with thee. Verse 2, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom, and apply thine heart to understanding. Yea, verse 3, if. And notice what he lists moving forward. Thou criest after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding. If, verse 4, thou seekest her as silver, and searches for her of hidden treasures. Then look at the first word in verse 5. What's the next word? Then. If, then. Wisdom is so simple to understand. It's a causal relationship. If you do these things will happen. How many times have you looked at someone and said, if you continue making the decisions you make, here's what will happen? And what do they always say? No, that won't happen to me. Wisdom says life is really more simple than it seems. John DeBerry is a prolific preacher of the gospel. He was also a member of the Tennessee Senator House for years and years and years. And in the Memphis area. Wonderful preacher, wonderful man. And I saw him quoted on Facebook just the other day as saying this: when we're born, we look like our parents. When we die, we look like our decisions. And isn't that true? You know, we resemble our parents when we're born and our choices as we age. You see, we are what we choose to do. And the choices that we make define who we are. If-then statements. He continues in chapter 3. And this time these are expanded and exemplified. In verse 1, my son, forget not my law, let thine heart keep my commandments. Look at verse 2. If you do that, what's going to happen? For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee, if then. Look at verse 4, or verse 3 rather. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of thine heart. Why? So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man, if then. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, lean not on thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him. What? He shall direct thy paths. Verse 7, be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord, depart from evil. And what will happen? Verse 8, it shall be health to thy navel and marrow to thy bones. What you'll see is if you march through chapter 3, there's always do this and this will happen. Do this and this will happen. Do this and this will happen. It's not that hard. The decisions we make affect the options that we have moving forward. If then. And wisdom cries and says, listen to just how simple it is. Do these things, and these things will be the potential consequence. Or, do these things, and this will be the potential consequence. And we need to recognize that, listening to wisdom. And you can trace through chapter 3 and you can see it even more. You look at verse number 21. My son, let not them depart, that is, my commandments, from thine eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. So shall they be life unto thy soul and grace to thy neck. And then shalt thou walk in the way safely. Thy foot shall not stumble. So notice there is a command and then a promise. A command and then a promise. If then. If then. But you compare that to the voice of folly. You see, no matter where we go, no matter how old we are, no matter how grounded and how firm our foundation, there are always two voices. There's the voice of wisdom, and there's the voice of folly. There's the voice of godliness, the voice of sin. As I mentioned, folly is personified in the book of Proverbs as a strange woman. You pick up with me in chapter 2 and verse 14. It talks about those who rejoice to do evil, who, it says, delight in the frowardness of the wicked, whose ways are crooked and they forward in their paths to deliver thee, verse 16. Here's Solomon's goal. To deliver thee from the strange woman, even from the stranger, which flattereth with her words. In verse 12, he had described the evil man that speaks forward things. So it's not necessarily a woman per se or a man per se. It's the personification of wickedness and folly and sin. But I want you to notice the qualities of this voice. Number one, notice her attitude. Verse 14 says, who rejoice to do evil and delight in the forwardness of the wicked. You see, folly presents sin as a delight, as something to be rejoiced in, rather than something to be hated and despised. So its attitude towards sin is much different than what wisdom would have us to believe. Chapter 2 and verse 16, to deliver thee from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flattereth with her words. You see, folly knows how to characterize things, how to shade things in such a way to make it as appealing as absolutely possible. And the flattery with which folly approaches us so often entangles us. You see, wisdom is very blunt. I guarantee there are people in your lives who tell you what you need to hear. But we don't like listening to those people, do we? We would rather find a voice who will tell us what we want to hear, who will flatter us as folly does, not who will challenge us as wisdom does. And so that voice of folly characterizes sin differently. Hold your finger there and go to chapter 5. Verse 3 goes on to describe this strange woman. For the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb. Her mouth is smoother than oil. Oh, folly can sell herself to you. Sin can market itself to you. And isn't that really the greatest marketing tool that the world has? What does the marketing, the ad world, what do they appeal to in their marketing, their ad campaigns? They appeal to the basest parts of us, right? To the most sensual and worldly desires that we possess. Envy, greed, sensuality, all of those things are the foundational aspects of marketing. You see, folly knows how to sell itself to us. It knows how to characterize itself in such a way that we don't realize often until it's too late. Chapter 2 and verse 17, it goes on, which forsaketh the God of her youth and forgetteth the covenant of her God. You see, folly has a selective memory. It only remembers the things that it wants to remember. It forgets about God. It forgets about righteousness because it's devoting all of its energy and all of its time to sin. And therefore God is forgotten when it comes to folly. But notice the results. And we, if we do anything, need to recharacterize sin to our children, to our contemporaries, and to ourselves. Let's stop glorifying sin, because here's its end. Look at verse 18 of chapter 2. For her house inclineth unto death, and her paths unto the dead. None that go unto her returneth again, neither take they hold of the paths of life. You see, if you heed the siren song of sin, well, you're setting yourself up for a pathway to destruction. He goes on in chapter 9 to even describe it more detailed. Chapter 5 and verse 9, he says, remove thy way, verse 8, from her. Come not nigh the door of her house. Again, he says, don't even put your foot in the doorway of folly. Because here's what's going to happen, verse 9. Lest thou give thine honor unto others, thy years to the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, thy labors be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. Now, I can only imagine that Solomon here is speaking at least to some degree from experience. When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away from God. And Solomon had to live his last years in regret for the way that he had conducted himself and the decisions that he had made and the voices that he had heeded. And notice what he says in verse 12. How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. And have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instructed me. And he finally says in verse 14, I was almost in all evil, in the midst of the congregation and assembly. I had so ingrained myself in evil that it didn't matter where I was. That's what surrounded me. You see, Solomon lays the groundwork for everything else that he'll address in the book in these first few chapters by giving us the foundation of Proverbs and thus the foundation of wisdom. Number 1, fear the Lord. Number 2, choose, and choose wisely. Number 3, as you do that, listen to the voice of wisdom and ignore and resist the voice of folly. You see, that's the groundwork that Solomon lays in the book of Proverbs. And so we're going to, as we have opportunity over the next little while, go over and focus on a proverb here and there as we have the chance. But this evening, who are you listening to? Is the voice of folly enticing you? Has sin's voice called for you, and have you heeded? If so, if you're a Christian tonight who has heeded the voice of folly, let us help you return to God tonight. But maybe it's the case that you never have listened to wisdom. Maybe you've heard her cry in the streets. Maybe you've heard as she lifted her voice up, but you failed to heed. And maybe tonight you realize this is the night for me to listen to wisdom. This is the night for me to fear the Lord, to obey Him and recognize His authority and submit to it in my life. Will you believe in Jesus Christ? Will you repent of your sins, confess your faith, and be baptized? Can we help you tonight to obey the gospel or to be restored? Let us do it as together we stand and sing.